I had to make a statement, especially because this platform is a really big person of interest, fandom site where it's become a cult classic on this particular platform due to the outspoken nature of channels such as 5 by 5 takes and everything. And I really thank them because I agree with their take on the whole thing completely. But, I was talking about the show during its infamous run and everything on Twitter and everything, and particularly during season 3 and beyond. I was personally warned by a girl, you know, who happened to use some of the same social networks that there were people that were going around bullying people that were upset, about or that were still watching because they were organizing a boycott in the wake of what happened to Joyce Carter on the show and everything and her death. And they were trying to tell me, but it was still a fan of it. How can you support something like that when they killed off our girl and everything? And they started to organize an active protest against her. And it knowing better, knowing why certain things like that happen on shows, and that it's often not like that. When an actress is killed off in a show, it's often because the actress wants off the project or whatever. I began to, why what that it's often more complicated than that. It wasn't really a desire to you know get rid of the character and everything, but why she left was that Detective Jock Carter was killed off in Person of Interest season 3 because the actress Tara G. BP Henson was creatively unfulfilled in her role, unfulfilled, and sought new opportunities. Showrunners also felt that it was a necessary narrative move to raise the stakes, prove that no character was safe, and conclude her arc after the HR storyline. The key reasons for Carter's death: the creative decision and actor's request. Hanson was not creatively happy and wanted to move on to other projects, although she knew her character's departure was planned. Despite the fact that this was a hit, with a lot of people, a lot of us still, cannot forget the show, finding it unforgettable. And even though it's become quite the old show ever since it was put off, we just haven't been able to forget that it was on the air at all on CBS. We still remember it the way that I still remember The Pretender, and everything, and that show that was on in the 90s. The narrative stakes, producer Jonathan Nolan and Greg Plagueman wanted to prove that the show's anybody can die promise was real, as the characters had become too comfortable in their roles. The conclusions of plot lines, Carter's storyline, particularly regarding the HR corruption, had reached its natural conclusion. Well, anyways, this had turned it, a you know and then we can look at it even more, about how this is more about the actress than about the show wanting to write her out. Detective Carter left Person of Interest because the actress had sought more challenging leading roles, feeling creatively unsatisfied and, quote, miserable, unquote, with the repetitive nature of playing a strong but often sidelined character, leading to her character's definitive death in season 3, to allow for new story arcs, and for Henson's character to move on to shows like Empire. Why some felt the story ran its course, it was largely driven by Henson's desire for career advancement and creative fulfillment. The creative rut. Henson felt her character, Detective Carter, had become stagnant, often playing the role of the rule follower, of being sidelined from the machine plot, making the work mundane. The desire for lead roles. She expressed wanting to move from being third on the call sheet to a true leading role, a goal achieved with Empire. Stole her joy. Henson famously stated that the role stole her joy, indicating a lack of creative excitement. The showrunner's perspective, natural character art, producers felt Carter's journey needed a definitive end, fitting into the show's realistic portrayal of life being cut short, preventing audience fatigue, a real death for a main character, preventing the show from becoming predictable and maintain dramatic stakes, according to the showrunner Jonathan Nolan. You know, the outcome, Carter's death in season 3 was impactful, allowing for the growth of her other characters like Root and Shaw, fitting into the evolving narrative. Although many fans loved her, many fans missed her. So during the time of all this, and why it was going on, and there was a backlash to the fact that she was removed, and a lot of these people, had essentially organized a campaign to bully people who had stayed loyal to the show, and had essentially you know continued to watch, despite the fact that that they had done this to her and done her dirty, as her character dirty, on the show by getting rid of her. I mean, if you were still watching after season 3, there you almost had to stay silent about it, because there were people that would come after you and bully you about it and everything because of that. And meanwhile, we find out exactly why they wrote her out of the show, and it turns out, it turns out that the actress just had so much ambition, that she felt that she was not given a prominent enough role on the show, and she wanted off the project, so they wrote her out of it. It was at the actress's request that this be done, and so the people that are like, well, they were inclusive, and now they killed off the black woman on the show, and what, we were giving them inclusivity points at first, and now we're taking it away. Please. Look into things deeper than that. Like, look beyond the surface. Look at the truth of the matter. Research the actress who was actually playing the role and what her perspective on things was and what she said about things. Now, I disagree with her. I would be very excited to work on a show like that. I would be, creatively, I would find it great fun. But hey, here. Anyways, just wanted to say this about Person of Interest, and to make some content about it myself, although my skills as with video editing are kind of shit, but, it doesn't mean I don't have a perspective on anything related to it. I was a big fan of it. I signed the petition to save the show and everything, and I thought it was a lot of crap. I still continue to think it's a lot of crap what happened to it and how the audience did it dirty. It was a particularly it was a must-watch television for me, and yet, here we have all these people who somehow think it went downhill after season 3. I don't really like episodic television, to say the least. I want shows that you're not going to convince a man who was raised on the serialized stories of anime, and how there were arcs and all of it, to find great joy and be convinced that serialized television is a problem. Like, I started watching Star Trek, but as soon as I started to realize the original series was not serialized and was episodic, I lost all interest in it. Happened pretty quickly, and so I started watching the other stuff that was serialized with Star Trek, because that's what I wanted. I didn't want Monster of the Week style episodes. I'm not a big fan of that sort of thing. I mean, every now and then I guess there's a golden one like Josie Chung's From Outer Space with respect to the X-Files that I deeply, deeply do not regret having watched. But, after a while, the filler episodes can get a little bit tiring when there's a wider mythology, and so that was kind of like a great point to step out on, as being the last filler episode with the X-Files that you watched. Which it pretty much, I felt I wanted to go out with a bang as far as that was concerned during my watch of it, and that's where I exited. Then I just started watching the Myth Arc episodes, and, I just, with respect to television history and everything, and I'm not a big fan of episodic television. I mean, I guess every here and there are exemptions to it, but overall, I prefer a serialized show, and the fact that that was taken, in these other contexts in a way like that, I didn't like. And anyways, regarding Person of Interest, this backlash movement that was largely because there was so much pressure to be more inclusive, and Person of Interest did exactly that for 3 whole seasons, and pretty much gave the lady behind it a career. I mean, her character was not the major character in the plot, but she was prominent enough of a role that everybody who watched remembers her. She's not forgotten. In fact, you know, some of the stuff that happened on the show after she died shows a deep, abiding respect for the character and her role in the show, and how everybody on it was traumatically impacted by what had happened to her. They gave her a very soulful, you know, send off and everything, the full, three gun salute essentially, and it was tragedy. It hurt. It was a body blow for pretty much everyone and the entire fandom. We all felt it. We all missed her. We all felt devastated by the attack. It was a body blow for everybody, and the show acknowledged that. It showed the pain and everything of the loss and all of that, and even Elias, eventually getting revenge. Even the mob boss eventually got revenge, for it on Simmons, and HR as his leader and everything. They took him down. That impassioned speech by Lionel, the other cop, I forget his name. Lionel Fosco, yeah. Sorry, it's been a while, so I was just double checking the name there because I thought it was Lionel, but I just it had been a while with respect to him. I know what he's talking about, but yeah, with that scene where he's kicking the crap out of you know the leader of HR, the boss there, he's attacking him and everything. When he attacks him and everything during that scene after it and everything. He talks about how Josh Carter saved him and everything and made him a better person, and he refuses to actually take down and kill him. HR after that, and so the there was such a there was and it ends up being Elias who takes him down and everything. That shows, at the end of the day, this character was given a very, very strong send off in sorrow and everything, and even the mob boss wanted, him dead after that. They like, you gotta, yeah, and if the mob boss is doing out of moral outrage and conviction rather than just, this cop interfered with our plans and everything, you done fucked up when even some of the badasses and the wicked ones that are smugglers and druggies and catering to that sort of illegal profiteering, that those parties are of that in essence that anyways, forget what I was saying there, but they gave her a very great send off and everything, and I mean, anyways, just the whole let's bully people who stayed loyal to the end of this, kind of gets a massive like what the fuck, like wait, actually investigate, like actually see what happened, like don't just rush to judgment and a sort of fuck you to them for what happened to her. And there are people who now, even to this day, swear up and down that it went downhill after season 3, and I must profusely and profoundly disagree with those people. Season 3 is the turning point when the show started to get much better, and it really did go out with a bang. The later seasons are the superior seasons with Person of Interest. The first two are kind of weak.